In the last lecture we asked, are the groups different? ANOVA answered that question. A significant F tells you that at least one group differs from at least one other group. In this video, we ask the harder questions. How big is the difference, and what does it actually mean? Because here's the truth. A statistically significant result is only as good as the design that produced it. You can have the best p-value in the world from a terribly designed study, and it tells you almost nothing. And you can have a modest p-value from a beautifully designed study, and it tells you a lot. So this video has two parts. First, we'll talk about effect size for ANOVA, how to measure the magnitude of group differences. And then we'll step back and think about the architecture of your study itself, because the conclusions you can draw are not determined by your statistics. They're determined by your design. Let's start with effect size. We have learned that t-tests have Cohen's d. ANOVA has something similar. It's called Eta-squared, written as the Greek letter eta with a superscript 2. Eta-squared is calculated as between group sum of squares divided by total sum of squares. It tells you the proportion of total variance explained by group membership. How much of the variation in your outcome is accounted for by which group someone is in. If eta-squared equals 0.01, group membership explains 1% of the variance. That's a small effect. If eta-squared equals 0.06, group membership explains 6%. That's a medium effect. And if eta-squared equals 0.14 or larger, that's a large effect. Group membership explains 14% or more of the total variance. Here's why this matters. You can have a statistically significant effect that is very small in size. Your p-value might be 0.02, which is significant. But your eta-squared might be 0.02, which is tiny. The groups are reliably different, but the difference is not large enough to matter in the real world. A large effect size means your treatment made a real difference. A small effect means it did something, but not much. Always report both the p-value and eta-squared. Remember that they answer different questions. Significance asks whether the effect is real. Effect size asks whether it matters. In Jamovi, you tick the eta-squared box alongside your ANOVA output. You'd report it like this: F brackets 257 equals 6.3, P equals 0.003, eta-squared equals 0.09. That last number tells you feedback type explained 9% of exam score variance, a medium effect. Now, let's talk about what your result actually means. Can you claim your treatment caused the outcome? Internal validity is the degree to which your study supports a causal inference. Did the treatment cause the outcome, or was it caused by something else? To infer causality, you need three things. You need manipulation. Your study must actually do something to one group but not the other. You need control, a comparison or a baseline. And you need random assignment. Participants must be randomly assigned to groups so that the groups are equivalent before the treatment begins. Random assignment is the key ingredient. It's the only method that ensures differences between groups after the study are caused by the treatment and not by pre-existing differences between people in those groups. When you have random assignment, you have high internal validity. Without it, you have to be much more cautious. Let me lay out the hierarchy of research designs in terms of their internal validity. At the top is the true experiment. You actively manipulate an independent variable. Participants are randomly assigned to conditions. They don't choose which group they're in. You control the conditions carefully. This gives you the strongest basis for causal inference. If there are systematic differences between your groups and the outcome, those differences are most likely due to your treatment. One level down is the quasi-experiment. In a quasi-experiment, you have manipulation and a comparison group, but you do not have random assignment. Participants end up in groups through some non-random process. The canonical example is you compare depression in people who chose to seek therapy versus people on a wait list. You've done something, therapy, to one group, but people weren't randomly assigned. They chose. And people who choose therapy are probably different from people who don't in ways that matter. Maybe they have stronger social support, more financial resources, or less severe depression to begin with. When you find that the therapy group improves more, you can't tell if it's because of the therapy or because of who's selected into it. This is the core problem with quasi-experiments. Quasi-experiments still do something to groups, but without random assignment, you can't rule out that the groups were already different before anything happened. And then at the bottom is the observational study. In an observational study, there's no manipulation and no random assignment. You observe groups that differ naturally on some variable and measure an outcome. You're not doing anything to anyone, you're just looking at differences that already exist. An example would be that you compare depression in people who exercise regularly versus people who don't. You're not assigning exercise, you're observing naturally occurring variation. Observational studies have the lowest internal validity for causal inference. The groups may differ in dozens of ways beyond the variable that you're studying. When you find that exercisers are less depressed, you can't tell if exercise caused it or if one of those other differences did. Here's the key principle. The design constrains inference. A true experiment with a modest effect size tells you more than an observational study with a huge effect size. The design is primary, the statistics are secondary. Now, let's name the specific threats that most often undermine internal validity, especially in quasi-experiments and observational studies. And the most important threat, as we've covered before, is selection bias. People in different groups may be systematically different before anything happens. In the therapy example, the people who seek therapy may already be more motivated, more resilient, or at a different stage of their problem. When you find group differences in the outcome, you can't separate the effect of your treatment from the effect of who was in each group. Random assignment is so powerful precisely because it prevents selection bias. It doesn't eliminate individual differences, it just stops them from clustering systematically in one group. A second major threat is attrition, differential dropout. People drop out of studies and they don't drop out randomly. In a long intervention study, people in the treatment group who are improving tend to stay. People who aren't improving tend to leave. By the end, your treatment group is enriched for people who are going to do well regardless. The control group may not show this pattern. So the effect you see is partly a treatment effect and partly a selection artifact from dropout. A third threat is history and maturation. Over time, people change. They mature. Major events happen in the world. If your study spans months or years, participants might improve or decline for reasons having nothing to do with your treatment. A therapy study that lasts 6 months will show improvement in many people simply because of natural recovery. The solution is a good control group that spans the same time period. Then history and maturation affect both groups equally, and the difference between them is more likely to be due to the treatment. A fourth threat is regression to the mean. If you select people who score extremely high or extremely low on a measure, say the top 10% on an anxiety scale, and then retest them after a treatment, their scores will probably move toward the average. Not because of your treatment, but because extreme scores are partly chance. On the day you first measured them, they happen to be at their worst. When you measure again, that chance variation is less likely to push them to the same extreme, so they look like they improved even with a placebo. This is responsible for a great deal of confusion in applied and clinical research. Any intervention applied to a select extreme group will appear to work, at least a little. The only way to isolate the treatment effect is to have a control group of equally extreme scorers who received no active treatment. There are other threats worth knowing by name. Demand characteristics. Participants change their behavior based on what they think the experimenter wants. Testing effects. Prior exposure to a measure inflates later scores. And instrumentation. Changes in the measurement process over time. These matter in specific contexts. The four I just detailed, selection, attrition, history maturation, and regression to the mean, are the threats that come up most often and most seriously in psychological research. Now we shift. Internal validity asks, did the treatment cause the effect in the study? External validity asks, do the results generalize beyond this study? External validity is the degree to which findings from a study apply to other people, places, and times. A study can have strong internal validity. The effect is real. It was caused by the treatment, and still have weak external validity if the sample is not representative of the population you want to generalize to. And this brings us to one of the most important critiques in modern psychology. Henrich, Heine, and Nourizayan published a paper in 2010 called The Weirdest People in the World, where weird, W-E-I-R-D, stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Their argument, most psychology research is conducted on weird samples, particularly undergraduates in North America and Europe. These people are not representative of humanity. They show different patterns of reasoning, emotion, and social behavior compared to people from non-weird societies. The implication is serious. Many findings in psychology might not be about human nature in general. They might be about the nature of people in one particular cultural context. External validity is often assumed rather than tested, and that's not good science. So let me tie everything together. You run an ANOVA, you get p equals 0.001 and eta squared equals 0.15, highly significant, a large effect. You're tempted to say, my treatment worked, mission accomplished. But before you conclude anything, ask, what design produced this result? If it's a true experiment with random assignment, good control, and careful measurement, you can confidently say the treatment caused the effect in this study. If your sample is representative, you can cautiously generalize. If it's a quasi-experiment with no random assignment, the groups differed significantly, but there might be confounds. Be cautious about causal inference. Name the threats. If it's an observational study, there's an association, but you cannot infer causality. Full stop. This is why design comes first. Statistical significance tells you the groups are unlikely to be equal by chance. Effect size tells you how big the difference is. But neither tells you whether the treatment caused the difference or whether the finding will hold in a new sample. Those questions are answered by your design, not your statistics. Now let me name the misconception I hear most often. If p is less than 0.05 and eta squared is large, then the study is done. The finding is solid. This confuses three different things. Statistical significance tells you the effect is unlikely to be chance. Effect size tells you the effect is large. But neither tells you it's causal or generalizable. You can have p less than 0.05 with a large effect size in a badly confounded observational study, and the conclusion you draw might still be wrong. Statistics are tools. They quantify uncertainty in your numbers. Design is what determines whether those numbers mean anything about the world. Here's your quick check. A quasi-experimental study shows that people who choose to exercise have significantly lower depression than people who don't. The effect is large. What design threat limits our ability to draw a causal conclusion? Think about it. The answer is selection bias. People who choose to exercise are probably systematically different from people who don't in ways that could affect depression. They might be more motivated, more social, or healthier to begin with. We can't tell if exercise caused a lower depression or if the groups were already different. To improve this, you'd randomly assign people to an exercise program or a control condition. And then if the groups differ in depression, you can be more confident exercise caused it. You've now completed two major parts of this course. Weeks 3 through 5, how to think about research questions, designs, and validity. Weeks 6 through 11, how to gather data, summarize it, and test hypotheses using statistics. And now we've come full circle. Design and statistics are inseparable. Good statistics on a bad design tell you very little. Good design with appropriate statistics, that's where you can actually learn something about the world. Next week, we move into a new statistical territory, correlation and regression. So far, we've been asking, are these groups different? Next week, we ask, are these variables related? And can one predict the other? That shift from comparing groups to modeling relationships opens up a whole new set of questions, and it comes with its own set of traps, particularly around mistaking a predictive relationship for a causal one. See you then. Bye.